Hey, what's up, YouTube fans? What I want to talk about in this video is the reducibility of the human reproductive system, right? Because there's a common argument made by intelligent design advocates trying to counter evolution, where they will say that there are certain biological systems that evolutionary processes cannot account for, so they claim, because they're irreducibly complex, meaning that it doesn't work unless you have all the parts in at once, or at least most of the parts, right? And so therefore they claim that you cannot have a step-by-step process where you gradually evolve every individual part of it step by step through a process of mutations and natural selection. They claim that that cannot explain these biological systems, because they claim that it doesn't work if you have unless if you have all the parts in at once, or at least most of them. Last week I did a video where I broke down how the human digestive system is not irreducibly complex, and I demonstrated that it isn't with comparison to other animals, right? And now I want to do the same with the human reproductive system, right? First off, there are some features of the human reproductive system that are unique to us, not found in our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, such as the females having a wider pelvis, right? Which likely has to do with that we have larger heads, so it helps to have a larger pelvis to fit out the bigger head, right? Um, but our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, their reproductive system is mostly identical to ours, and it still works just fine in spite of the few differences between our reproductive system and ours. Another difference is we don't have a penis bone, right? There's no bone in our penis. But overall, our reproductive system is nearly identical to theirs. And theirs works just fine in spite of the differences from ours. So that demonstrates the reducibility of those traits unique to the human reproductive system. Next, not all animals have only two nipples, both located on the chest. Not even all mammals do. The fact that we have only, amongst mammals, there's many different variations between different groups, of the amount of nipples and the location, right? The amount of teats. But it is because we are anthropoids that we have only two teats. And then it is because we are catarrhines, that's one of the two living groups of anthropoids. It's because of that that our nipples are located on our chest, right? Whereas in the New World monkeys, their nipples are located more close to the armpits, which is similar to what we see in bats. And it's also because we're anthropoids that the females of our species typically menstruate. At least by the time they're adults, they menstruate. That's not the case for the vast majority of animals, and not even for the vast majority of mammals. According to the National Library of Medicine, approximately 98% of mammal species do not menstruate, right? But because we are anthropoids, the females of our species do menstruate, right? And so it's the same for chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, even baboons and macaques. all of them menstruate just like how humans menstruate. And okay, next, um, primates, including humans, are part of a clade known as the Boreotherians. A clade, for those of you that don't know, that means a group that includes a common ancestor species and all of its descendant species. DNA evidence indicates that primates are part of a clade called the Boreotherians, and the main distinguishing feature of Boreotherians, aside from genetic similarities, is that for most Boreotherians, with some exceptions, most Boreotherians have the males have external testicles, right? So that explains why we have external testicles. The males of our species do. It didn't have to be that way. Our next closest living relative, the atlantogenates, the males have internal testicles, right? So, but they still have a fully functional reproductive system, a reproductive system which is mostly the same as ours, but the males have internal testicles, right? And these are the two main, those are the two living subdivisions of placentals, right, are the Boreotherians and atlantogenates. And there's a number of distinguishing features of the placental reproductive system. So some of the big traits of the placental reproductive system are that all placentals have an umbilical cord, which results in a belly button, right? So all placentals have a belly button, everything from elephants to bats to humans. But it didn't have to be that way. Marsupials, they do not have an umbilical cord, and they still manage just fine to reproduce. They still have, mostly the same reproductive system as us. Their development is fundamentally mostly the same as us. They share most of the same fundamental anatomical structure as us, right? It all works just fine without an umbilical cord. So it didn't have to always be present in our ancestry from the beginning, right? It didn't have to always exist in our ancestry, right? As opposed to coming about as a later evolutionary improvement upon an already existing reproductive system. And another trait of the placental reproductive system is that placentals carry our pregnancies to a much longer term than marsupials, right? Placental females do, right? But again, it didn't have to be that way. The marsupials, they still have most of the same fundamental anatomical structure as we do, right? And they get by just fine, even though they carry their pregnancies to a shorter term, right? And placentals and marsupials are together the two living members of a clade called the Therians, right? And Therians are distinguished by a number of reproductive similarities. Most significant is that all Therians give live birth rather than laying eggs, right? But it didn't have to always be that way from the beginning, because there's plenty of species that lay eggs, right? And you can have an intermediate between laying eggs and giving live birth. We know that you can have an intermediate because at least one example I know of, there's a reptile species alive today that both lays eggs and gives live birth, right? And if you guys are like, how come you only, and so I don't off the top of my head know the example, but if you just like Google reptile species that both lays eggs and gives live birth, it'll take 2 seconds. You're guaranteed to find what I'm talking about. And if any of you are like, how come you can only think of one example? Well, this is a rare evolutionary transition to occur, right? So like, for example, birds, there's about 10,000 living species of birds. There's more species of birds alive than mammals. And every single one of them, without exception, all birds, big and small, they all lay eggs rather than giving live birth, right? So it's a rare evolutionary transition. But we do have an example, at least one, probably others, of a species where they both lay eggs and give live birth, so you can have an intermediate. Um, and also, because we are Therians, we don't have a cloaca, right? Which is something we find in monotremes, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and many groups of fish, which is a single hole used for pooling, peeing, and reproducing. It's all done through one hole, right? Most Therians do not, right? And if you're scratching your head as to, how could genetic mutations ever change something like that, you might be interested to know we actually, during our early stages of embryonic development, start out having a cloaca. And in some rare instances, a person can be born with a cloaca. It happens in rare instances. But later into development, it typically divides into separate holes, right? And then it's also because we are Therians that we have teats. Monotremes, which are the only egg-laying mammals alive today, they have mammary glands but no teats, right? Which demonstrates that you do not have to have both come in at once, right? Because the monotremes, they have fully functional mammary glands. They still use the mammary glands, right? The babies drink from those mammary glands, but no teat, right? So the teats can come about as a later improvement. It doesn't have to come in at the same time all at once in a single step, right? And then next is because we are mammals that we have mammary glands. The evolutionary origin of the mammary glands is that sweat glands were some of the sweat glands were adapted towards the purpose of mammary glands. If I'm not mistaken, I don't for certain remember that off the top of my head, but regardless, our next closest living relatives, the reptiles and birds, most of them do not have mammary glands or anything of the sort, but their reproductive system still works just fine. They got on just fine without that. And mammals, reptiles, and birds are all collectively the living members of a clade known as the amniotes, right? And amniotes are distinguished by amniotic eggs, right? Even us, even though we don't lay eggs anymore, we are still fertilized in amniotic eggs, right? And there's a number of features of the amniotic egg that differ from the amphibian egg. Amphibians are our next closest living relatives. But the amphibians, they still get on just fine without amniotic eggs. And their fundamental development is mostly the same as us. Their fundamental anatomy is mostly the same as us. But they do not have amniotic eggs, right? Their eggs are non-amniotic. So the eggs do not have to, from the beginning, have been amniotic. Also, most amniotes have a penis, right? Although developmental evidence would indicate that the mammal penis is not homologous to the reptile penis, mammals and reptiles most likely independently evolved the penis, right? And the penis helps with internal fertilization, right? Allowing the sperm to more directly get to the female's eggs, but it did not have to be that way from the beginning. Most amphibians fertilize externally, right? And so they have no need for a penis, right? So the penis did not have to exist from the beginning, right? Contrary to the notion that it all has to exist from the beginning or else it won't work at all. That's, contradicted, if you learn anything about, the anatomy of other groups of living things, it's very quickly disproven that notion. Um, and then next, in order to reproduce, and even in order to reproduce sexually, right, you do not need a nervous system, right? So sponges, which are the most primitive known animals, they're the animals we find in the earliest, they're the earliest animal fossils we have are sponges, and they have no brain, no nerves, right? But they still reproduce, and they can even reproduce sexually, right? But sponges also can reproduce asexually, right? So you can have intermediate between asexual and sexual. It doesn't have to be a switch right from only asexual to only sexual. You can have an intermediate. And of course, there are living things which do reproduce asexually, right? And they still get on just fine, right? And so you don't even, for some simple biological systems, some simple species, you don't even need, even some complex species, there are some tetrapods which have, gone on to become capable of reproducing asexually, right? So like there's some lizards that can reproduce asexually, right? So you don't even need to have sexual reproduction in order to have a fully functional reproductive system, right? And so this is a common trend that you'll find, is that, for any of these biological systems that they claim are irreducibly complex, at least, on the multicellular level, you'll find again and again that, when we compare it with, other groups of living things, in order to claim that it's irreducibly complex, takes a lack of knowledge of these other creatures' anatomy, because you quickly will find that you don't need to have all of these things existing all at once. There's many varying degrees of complexity, and which creatures are most similar to us in things like their reproductive system is consistent with which animals we predict are most closely related to us, right? Predicted based on completely independent lines of evidence, right? All right, that's all for now. See you guys.